A TWA Boeing 727 descends through the murky clouds on a snowy December morning. In a few short minutes, the flight crew will deliver their 85 passengers to Washington. As turbulence rocks the plane from side to side, the pilots grow increasingly confused about where they are supposed to be. Minutes previously, a misunderstanding had developed between them and the air traffic controller who'd been guiding them in. This simple misunderstanding will soon snowball into a full-blown catastrophe, which will shake the aviation industry to its core. This is the story of TWA Flight 514. It was a cold, crisp morning in December of 1974. At Columbus Airport in Ohio, TWA Flight 514 had just arrived in from Indianapolis. From here, it would take 85 passengers and 7 crew to Washington National Airport in Washington, D.C. On this day, the aircraft was under the command of Captain Richard Brock. Brock was 44 years old and had been a captain on the 727 for the past 3 years. In this time, he'd accumulated just shy of 3,000 hours on the aircraft. He had an excellent training and performance record, with no apparent weaknesses in either his technical knowledge or his hands-on flying skills. Sitting to Brock's right that cold December morning was 40-year-old First Officer Leonard Kreshik. Kreshik had just over 1,000 hours on the 727 and had built up more than 6,000 flying hours in total. Like the captain, his training and performance record was unblemished. Joining the 2 pilots on the flight deck was 31-year-old flight engineer Thomas Safranek. Safranek was the least experienced flight crew member on board, with just over 100 hours on the 727. However, he still had over 3,000 hours on other aircraft as a flight engineer. By all indications, the passengers could not have been in safer hands on this day. As the pilots prepared the aircraft for the short hop to Washington, D.C., the 4 cabin crew completed their pre-flight checks and ensured that each of the 86 passengers on board were seated and had their seatbelts fastened. Nowadays, the Boeing 727 is an ancient artifact of an aircraft. There are none left in passenger service, and only a few governments and militaries use them. But in 1974, the 727 was at the cutting edge of aircraft design and avionics. Almost 2,000 were sold, and they made up significant portions of many airlines' short-haul fleets. The one being used on this day was still quite new, at just 4 years old. But even at that young age, it still wasn't as new as the new browser from Opera. Opera's new web browser unlocks the full potential of what the internet is today. I like the sleek minimalist interface, which allows me to organize my work cleanly and efficiently. The main way I do this is by using the Tab Islands feature. I find this really handy because as I browse the web and open loads of tabs, I can just organize them into islands grouped by common themes. So here I've got a tab island for movies I'm deciding between watching later. Here I've got an island for an upcoming trip, and here I've got an island for my work on Green Dot Aviation. I can expand and contract these tabs as I want, which makes it so much easier to stay organized and productive. I also find the sidebar here really useful. It has WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger built in, which makes it a lot easier to reply to any messages as you're browsing the web. You can also add Spotify, Instagram, and loads of other social media apps to stay connected more easily. And while you're browsing, you can stay safe by using the built-in VPN and ad blocker, which you can turn on with a single click. Opera even has its own AI, Aria, embedded into the browser. I find this really useful because whenever I have a question which Google can't answer, I just ask Aria. Opera really feels like the future of the web. Everything I need is just there in the browser itself. Click my link in the video description to download Opera. It's free, it's fast, and it just works. Now, let's get back to the video. By 10 o'clock that morning, Flight 514 was ready to depart Columbus. The journey to Washington would take just over an hour. The aircraft was carrying 13 tons of fuel, more than enough to reach the destination and then go back again without refueling. The pilot started the 3 engines and Captain Brock began taxiing the 727 out to the runway. So far, everything was going to plan. But it wouldn't be long before the plan started to fall apart. At 25 minutes past 10 that morning, Captain Brock powered the 727 into the cold December sky. As the passengers settled in for the hour-long trip, the captain turned the aircraft southeast, towards the nation's capital. But Washington, D.C. was not about to give the flight a warm welcome. The winds were howling across the active runway, reaching speeds of up to 49 knots, or 90 kilometers per hour. This was significantly beyond the Boeing 727's crosswind capabilities. Inbound flights were diverting or being made to enter holding patterns, and aircraft on the ground were being delayed. It was not the easy day of flying which the 3 flight crew had hoped for. And now, things were about to get worse. Just 12 minutes into the flight, while they were still climbing to their cruising altitude, the crew received bad news. Due to the strong crosswinds, Washington National Airport was now closed to all arrivals. Captain Brock had no choice. He had to divert. 36 kilometers to the west of Washington National lay Washington's other major airport, Dulles. As it happened, the conditions at Dulles weren't much better. There was low cloud, high winds, and snow. But at least for now, they were accepting arrivals. This would be where the captain would take the aircraft. For many of the passengers on board, this unplanned disruption to their journey was just an inconvenience. But it would significantly increase the workload for the flight crew. This last-minute change in destination on what was already a short sector would mean that time was now against them to prepare for the approach into Dulles. On short flights like this, pilots often have their approach charts ready for the expected landing runway at the destination. Sometimes, they even brief the arrival while on the ground at the departure airport. Now, the crew had to mentally extract themselves from Washington National, where they had been planning to go, and had to immediately begin preparing for an approach to the much less familiar Dulles Airport. This quick change in plan was the first trigger in a series of events which would be the unravelling of Flight 514. As the pilots reached cruising altitude, they began searching for the approach charts for Dulles Airport. As they did this, the captain radioed TWA Operations in New York and informed them that they would be diverting to Washington Dulles. The airline would now need to arrange handling for 85 frustrated passengers when they landed. Captain Brock told the passengers about the diversion, and then handed over the controls to First Officer Kreshik. Brock needed to get to grips with the approach and landing charts. It had been a long time since he had been to the airport, and he would only have a few minutes to understand how approaches were carried out there, before he would have to carry one out himself. At this point, the controller cleared Flight 514 to descend to an altitude of 23,000 feet. 2 sayings are drilled into every student pilot when they begin their training. The first of these is a list of priorities: aviate, navigate, communicate. This means that at all times, the first priority for any pilot is to maintain control of the aircraft, to aviate. Navigate refers to the fact that pilots must also clearly understand where they are and how high they are above the terrain. It is only when the above 2 tasks have been dealt with that the final priority of communicating with air traffic control is considered. But what happens when communication results in a breach of the other 2 maxims? In a few moments, we'll see why the story of TWA Flight 514 has been so instructive when it comes to this vital aspect of flying. The second saying that all pilots are told during their training is, "If in doubt, there is no doubt." In the coming minutes, an unfortunate combination of doubt and miscommunication would endanger the lives of everyone on board Flight 514. As the flight descended, the captain discussed the approach with Dulles Air Traffic Control. The plan was to approach the airport from the west via a radio beacon called Front Royal. From there, they would continue flying east until they intercepted the final approach track for runway 12. This final track was based on another radio beacon called Armel. It was a straightforward approach really. All the pilots needed to do was to tune their navigation radios to Front Royal and Armel, and to follow their respective needles until they were lined up with the runway. After receiving this clearance from air traffic control, the pilots reviewed the standard arrival charts into Dulles, known as approach plates. Along with information about track and distance, approach plates contain vital information about the lowest altitude the aircraft can fly at along any given track. This is known as the sector safe altitude, as in the altitude which is safe for that particular sector of airspace. When flying in cloud, a pilot literally entrusts the lives of his passengers and crew on the information contained within the details annotated on these charts. This is a copy of the chart used by the crew of Flight 514. On it, you can see that between Front Royal and Round Hill, where the pilots were cleared to, the minimum safe altitude was 3,400 feet. As long as they stayed above this altitude, they would be safe. Once they had reached Round Hill, the so-called initial approach fix, they would then be able to descend further to an altitude of 1,800 feet. 11.6 miles after reaching Round Hill was the final approach fix, just 6 miles from the airport. This section of the chart shows a side-on view of the approach, which includes the 6-mile final approach fix. From here, as this section of the chart shows, the pilots would be able to descend towards runway 12 from 1800 feet. As the crew of Flight 514 studied these charts, they built up a mental picture of the lateral and vertical position of the plane during the approach to Dulles. So far, they were aviating, navigating, and communicating. But that began to change when air traffic control radioed the flight with a new clearance. At 10 minutes to 11 that morning, Washington Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 514 to turn left onto a heading of 090 and to intercept the 300-degree radial from the Armel beacon. This line here is the 300-degree radial from Armel. It's a line heading out from the beacon at 300 degrees on the compass rose, which is roughly northwest, 360 degrees being north and 270 degrees being west. The reciprocal of 300 degrees is 120 degrees, so it is this heading that the pilots dialed into their navigation equipment. The controller's clearance to turn onto a heading of 090 was a shortcut for the flight. While this was nice to have, given that the pilots were already carrying out a diversion, it did present its own problem. The aircraft would no longer be following the routing as laid out in the approach plate. The crew had now effectively gone off-piste. You might think that being off-piste would have bothered the crew of Flight 514. After all, the Boeing 727 did not have any of the advanced systems that aircraft have these days, which show the pilots the surrounding terrain on large colourful navigation displays like this. All they had to rely on was their paper charts, their direction indicators, and their distance measuring equipment. But at least for the moment, being off-piste shouldn't have mattered too much. The controller had just cleared the flight to descend to 8,000 feet, which was well above the minimum safe altitude for the area. The flight engineer read the approach checklist and calculated the aircraft's final approach and landing speeds. The crew worked together, discussing items on the instrument approach chart, including the round hill intersection, the final approach fix, and also the visual approach slope indicator and runway lights. They also studied the airport diagram, which they would need to use when finding their way to the gate once they had landed. All was well as the plane continued its descent. At just past 11 AM, Washington Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 514 to descend further to 7,000 feet and instructed the crew to contact Dulles Approach Control. The captain contacted Dulles Approach, informing him that the aircraft was descending through 10,000 feet on its way down to 7,000 feet. The controller told the crew to proceed to Armel and to expect to land on runway 12. So far, apart from the non-standard approach path, the aircraft was still flying safely. However, at 4 minutes past 11, the controller made what was to be a fateful transmission. He cleared the flight for an approach to runway 12. At this point, Captain Brock and First Officer Kreshik made what was to be the first of several unfortunate assumptions. These assumptions were based not only on past experience, but also on a document published years earlier by the FAA, and then, unbeknown to the crew, quietly removed a few years later. In this document, an airman's manual, the FAA had stated that a crew should descend to the approach altitude as soon as possible upon reaching an approach clearance. As stated on the approach plate, the approach altitude from Round Hill was 1,800 feet. So, according to this FAA document, the crew were now permitted to descend to this altitude. However, this guidance made no sense in light of the aircraft's current position. It was still miles out from the Round Hill beacon, in an area where the minimum safe altitude was at least 3,400 feet. To make matters worse, another false assumption had now entered into the equation. As far as the pilots were aware, this ATC clearance meant that they were under radar guidance, and that they could continue the approach under the watchful eye of the air traffic controller. The pilots believed that if they descended below the minimum sector safe altitude, the controller would immediately notify them of that fact. However, despite what the pilots believed, legally speaking, the controller was under no obligation to provide a radar service. It was fully his choice whether he did this or not. And on this day, when the Dulles controller cleared Flight 514 for the final approach to runway 12, he believed he was not providing radar guidance, and therefore that the crew were responsible not only for their own navigation to the runway, but also for their own terrain separation. So, what we had was a situation where the pilots thought they were being monitored on radar, but the controller was not doing this. But what about the approach charts, which said that the minimum safe altitude for this sector was 3,400 feet? It was common knowledge among pilots that when air traffic controllers provided radar guidance, they sometimes cleared pilots to fly below the minimum descent altitudes shown on the crew's charts. This was because controllers used their own set of minimums that differed from those used by pilots. As a result, pilots became accustomed to controllers sending them below official minimums, and they began to rely less and less on their own approach plates to ensure terrain avoidance. All of this meant that on this cold December day above Washington, when the controller had cleared Flight 514 for the approach without giving any further instructions, Captain Brock interpreted this as meaning that there were no obstructions between his current position and the airport. Neither the pilots nor the controller understood what the other was planning or thinking. This breakdown in communication was now about to have devastating effects on the crew's ability to navigate, and even to aviate. As soon as the controller cleared the flight for the approach, the captain commented to his other two crew members, 1800 is the bottom, meaning that they were now able to descend to 1800 feet, the altitude at the final approach fix. The first officer replied, start down. However, the flight engineer wasn't so sure. The aircraft was still many miles out from the runway. There was no need to descend so soon, and without being on any of the approach paths on their charts, they didn't know where the terrain was around them. He expressed this concern to the pilots, saying that they were still, quote, out here quite a ways. This was the first hint of doubt exhibited by any of the crew. However, rather than raising this doubt in a more pointed way, he followed it up with a comment about the need to adjust the aircraft's air conditioning. Doubt had now quietly crept into the cockpit. In the cabin, the passengers were completely oblivious to the situation unfolding in the cockpit. The aircraft had descended into a thick layer of clouds, which it would remain inside until just a few moments before landing. Looking out the window, the passengers had little idea where they were, or how high they were above the ground. Ironically, the same could be said of the pilots. As the plane descended, it encountered strong turbulence. This turbulence was so strong, in fact, that the first officer complained about his altimeter needle jumping around. For a few moments, the pilots became fixated on the turbulence, which, in reality, was nothing more than an annoyance. The real danger to the flight was the pilots' lack of awareness that they would soon unwittingly descend below the peaks of the surrounding hills and mountains. At 7 minutes past 11, as Flight 514 descended towards 1800 feet, Captain Brock once again took the opportunity to study the approach chart a little closer. The fact that he did this was perhaps more evidence that doubt prevailed in the cockpit, and not just in the mind of the flight engineer. Irrespective of clearances from air traffic control, it is always the captain's responsibility to operate the aircraft safely. And so, on his second viewing of the chart, Brock got something of a surprise. He saw that the minimum descent altitude between Front Royal and Round Hill was 3,400 feet. This was quite a bit above the 1,800 feet he thought it was safe to descend to. Brock remarked to his crew that this dumb sheet says it's 3,400 feet to Round Hill is our minimum altitude. The flight engineer had also missed this vital piece of information, and asked the captain where on the chart he was referring to. At this point, alarm bells should have been ringing loudly in the crew's ears. If the minimum altitude just a few miles further south of their current position was 3,400 feet, why were they currently descending to just 1,800 feet? But if these alarm bells were ringing, they didn't ring for long, because what followed was not a careful study of the charts and a mapping of the aircraft's position onto them, but rather a combined effort to justify the course of action that the crew had already taken. After Brock had showed the other pilots that the minimum altitude a few miles further south was 3,400 feet, First Officer Kreshik challenged that fact and said, "When he clears you, that means you can go to your initial approach altitude," Brock said. This was a reference to the FAA document which stated exactly that. But regardless of any documents, the pilots now found themselves in a situation where serious doubt existed over the correct altitude they should be flying at. Therefore, there should have been no doubt about what to do next. Safranek then confirmed that the aircraft was still descending and was now lower than the safe altitude of 3,400 feet. The sad reality was that the navigate part of Aviate, Navigate, Communicate had all but been forgotten. The pilot's charts clearly showed mountains rising up to 1,930 feet and 1,764 feet on either side of their course, and yet the crew decided to continue their descent. They were now putting their faith and the passengers' lives in the hands of the non-existent radar control. The crew had now fully succumbed to the psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. This is the tendency to search for, interpret, and favour information which confirms your pre-existing beliefs. In this case, the flight crew were ignoring all of the information which suggested that they should climb to a safe altitude, and instead, they focused only on the information that supported a descent to 1800 feet. All it would have taken to fix this situation was one radio call to air traffic control to confirm the minimum altitude. But the crew never did this. But before we focus on this crew too strongly, it's worth considering that this was far from the first time a flight crew had found themselves in this position when flying into Dulles. Just a few weeks beforehand, an almost identical situation had occurred to the crew of United Airlines flight on its approach to the airport. They too had descended below the minimum safe altitude during their approach to Dulles, after being cleared for the approach while still 25 nautical miles from the airport. Just like the crew of Flight 514, that crew had failed to ask air traffic control whether they were under positive radar control. On that occasion, fate was on the crew's side. They had narrowly avoided a collision with Mount Weather on the final approach path to the airport. Immediately after this incident, United Airlines conducted a review and found that several pilots were routinely descending below minimum descent altitudes after receiving an early approach clearance. Without delay, the airline notified its crew that they must comply with the minimum altitudes unless they had confirmed with air traffic control that the aircraft was under positive radar control. Unfortunately, however, United Airlines didn't see it fit to inform the FAA of this incident. This oversight had deprived other airlines of the opportunity to gain valuable knowledge of this serious hazard. But so bad was the situation at Dulles that we don't even need to go back weeks to find more of these incidents. Just 30 minutes before TWA Flight 514 had started its approach, an American Airlines Boeing 727 was cleared for the approach to runway 12, again without being given a specific minimum altitude. The crew of that aircraft immediately contacted air traffic control to clarify whether they could descend to 1800 feet before the final approach fix. The controller stated that they could not. All the crew of Flight 514 had to do was to ask. Unfortunately for them, they were not on the same radio frequency when this transmission occurred. As happened so much on this day, they narrowly missed out on an opportunity to clear up their misunderstandings. Rain and snow now enveloped the aircraft as it continued its descent. Finally, the crew's navigation instruments informed them that they had now arrived at the 300-degree radial from Armel. They began the turn to the right to intercept the inbound track towards the runway. In just a few minutes, the flight would be landing. To be fair to all of the involved crews, there was more at play here than just negligence or complacency. The design of the approach plates made it difficult to see that they were at the wrong altitude. Their approach plate only showed the profile view of the approach from the final approach fix, just 6 miles from the runway, where the minimum altitude was 1800 feet. Any pilot who was distracted, or in a rush, or not used to the airport, could easily conclude that the minimum altitude was 1800 for a much larger portion of the approach. Again, apparently fixated on the turbulence, the first officer commented on how dark it was inside the cloud, and on how bumpy it was becoming. Captain Brock looked out his side window and caught a glimpse of the ground below the aircraft. The flight engineer did the same, catching sight of the ground for a few moments before it disappeared under a cloud. They were hoping to break out from underneath the cloud soon. If they did, they would have the final unignorable sign that they were flying headlong into danger. Ahead of the pilots, obscured by cloud, was the solid wall of rock that was Mount Weather. The crew were careening towards it at over 400 kilometers per hour. The turbulence worsened, causing the aircraft to drop down to 1700 feet. Realizing this, Kreshik said, "Power on this," and pushed the throttles forwards. Battered around by turbulence, the crew were beginning to lose all situational awareness. The first officer was fighting to stay on course, and he reassured the other pilots that he was staying on course. Of course, the flight was on course laterally speaking, the runway was straight ahead. But vertically, it was a full 1600 feet below where it should have been. Moments later, the flight hit another wall of turbulence. From behind the two pilots, Safran had commented, "Hang in there, boy, we're getting seasick." "Must have had a hell of a downdraft," said the first officer. The passengers were getting nervous, but for the wrong reason. Turbulence was not the problem here. At 9 minutes past 11, the pilots received the first warning that the aircraft was perilously close to the ground. The radio altimeter emitted a chime, indicating that the plane was only 500 feet above the ground. The crew would have been able to see from the distance measuring equipment that they were still a full 17 nautical miles from the airport, nowhere near the final approach fix. Normally, the pilots would not have been expecting to be at 500 feet until just a mile or two before the runway. There was no way to ignore it now. Something was seriously wrong. Captain Brock ordered the first officer to apply full power. Kreshik pushed the throttles fully forwards, summoning maximum thrust from the 3 engines. The passengers were pushed into their seats as the engines spooled up. A few seconds after the first warning, the radio altimeter issued another chime. This time, its message was dire. The aircraft was now just 100 feet above the ground. The crew were flummoxed, but there was no time to react. Less than 2 seconds later, the aircraft skimmed the trees near the summit of Mount Weather at an altitude of 1,670 feet. Moments later, the plane slammed into the mountain. It burst into flames immediately, its momentum flinging pieces of fuselage up over the top of the mountain. There was little left of the aircraft after the impact. None of the 92 passengers and crew had survived. Immediately after the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board began what would turn out to be one of the most consequential investigations in its history. The first major improvement which resulted from this accident was that the aviation industry focused on assembling a common lexicon to remove confusion over terminology during exchanges between pilots and air traffic controllers. Never again could such a simple misunderstanding lead to such devastating consequences. But the 2 most important changes to emerge from this accident had little to do with communication at all. They were technological, and I've already mentioned one of them in passing earlier in this episode. These 2 innovations would go on to improve the safety of passengers and crew around the globe forever, making accidents like this almost entirely a thing of the past. Shortly after the crash of Flight 514, the NTSB asked the FAA to mandate that all airliners be fitted with a GPWS, or Ground Proximity Warning System. This would unambiguously alert the crew that they were fast closing in on the terrain, and that they would need to take immediate action to save the aircraft. GPWS gives pilots significantly more warning time than the more basic systems of the past, and it has saved countless passenger lives in the years since its introduction. Another improvement which resulted in large part from this accident was an alerting system for controllers, which warns them when any aircraft deviates below the minimum safe altitude for any particular sector. And finally, after the crash, a nationwide reporting system was created, which allows pilots to report any incidents without fear of retaliation. Sadly, it took the deaths of all of those on board TWA Flight 514 to make these changes a reality, but all of us who fly today owe our safety to accidents like this.